Welcome to the Measure Success podcast, where we talk with top leaders about effective strategies that inspire success. Super excited to have with us an old, we've known each other since 8 years old. I mean, this is not our everyday guest. We've been reacquainted recently. Really haven't seen each other, frankly, much since high school. But you have this. So once again, for those who are listening, Jason Sherwood is the founder and creative director of Phase 23, a branding and design studio specializing in strategic brand development. He does interactive design, packaging, and he has extensive experience working with global brands and startups. He empowers courageous companies to grow and connect through bold and impactful design. Jason, welcome to the Measure Success podcast.
Thanks so much, Carl. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
We were having a lot of fun beforehand, just talking about fun and somber, like good and positive, of just, we're recording this for those who are right in the beginning of January 2025. And so, a lot of things have changed, just came off, unfortunately, the horrible bombings that just happened in New Orleans. And excuse me, I should call it bombings. Terrorist activity is the right thing to call it, that happened there. And it's interesting how these events can really change and impact our lives. Interestingly enough, that's what you do from a business perspective, right? You help create brands, which is about creating thought, idea, feeling towards why we might want to buy somebody's product or service. I mean, this is such an important part. I think often crazily misunderstood, right, by most people who are there. I know I don't fully understand it. I'm not going to pretend, Jason, to be an expert in this area. And then we're also going to talk about your entrepreneurial spirit you had before building up this company, because I think that's an interesting story as well. So this is going to be a really fun talk. We're going to not have as many conversations about us playing basketball hoops in elementary school against each other at Nate Gorman's house. Nate, if you're listening, shout out to you. Hope you're doing well, buddy. And Perry Reel, who also was that was typically is two and two first, unless we had other people come join us. We had a lot of intense basketball games, which was a lot of fun back then. And that was fun because we had the shorter hoops and we'd be able to jam it, right? And so we felt like Michael Jordan, even though we really couldn't jump. And so that was a lot of fun. But Jason, for those, let's just start. I know I gave you my script behind who you are. For those who don't know, what do you do? What's your day-to-day working with clients? How do you make a difference with them?
Yeah, my goal is, as you said, to try to take a company's business and help it succeed, right? Now, that sounds really, really broad, but we do it from the perspective of brand. As you said, a lot of people don't really have, or they think, maybe this is the more dangerous part, they think they understand what brand is, but usually they look at brand as a company owner or someone that's within the brand, and they think of brand as being something internal. Whereas the reality is brand is something it's external. It's something that it's the perception that others have of your company. Now, there's a lot that we can do to influence brand and how others perceive us. And that includes the nitty-gritty technical things like our logo and our colors and the way that we speak and the way that we communicate and the visuals that we use that helps to frame or to help influence the way that people perceive us. But inherently, that's not just the brand. We create brand standards, we create things that help people. But unless we're connecting all of those things in a strategic way and something that resonates with the people that we want to connect to, then oftentimes it can become dissonant. And sometimes people hear the word brand resonance or brand dissonance. And we use kind of a tried and true method where we talk about brand archetypes. We talk about how we approach those things in both a business strategy and a psychological strategy in the way that we connect people. So my background is absolutely 100% in design. I got a degree in graphic design. It's my love. It is my soul. I love design. But I grew up in a home with a father that was teaching me how to read P&Ls and the importance of how to run a business at a very, very early age. And so I was instilled with this idea that even though I wanted to be an artist, the reality was, in order for me to be successful in today's world, I needed to be able to do that from the perspective of running a business. So it's the way I've always approached being a designer, was helping my clients be successful in business. And so rather than just being someone's designer, I've always been, and it's what's helped me be really successful as a designer or a brand strategist, is being able to help clients outside of just making sure they look great.
Yeah, I love this conversation because what a gift. You probably didn't like it back then, but I mean, I can only imagine you just like fighting your dad because I mean, here you are, an art guy, right? You know, and you have your dad going, "No, it's about dollars and cents," and but you know this too. Truly, you know this, and this applied honestly forever. If you could be the greatest artist in the world, but if nobody hears you and if nobody buys your product, are you the greatest artist in the world?
Well, you hear all of these stories, and the greats, right? We talk about those that were these tortured, starving artists that only became masters or considered masters after they were dead, right? You know, I think Van Gogh probably would have enjoyed a little bit of success if people had acknowledged him during his lifetime. Others might argue that he never would have been the painter he was if he had been acknowledged in his lifetime. But that aside, it's interesting you mentioned that, you know, it was probably tough hearing my dad. I would say, yes, at times it was like, yeah, I just want to create something, right? But interestingly, because it was my dad, and I will say this in a maybe overly earnest way, because my dad was kind of my hero in a lot of ways,
Mm-hmm.
learning that and wanting to maybe legitimize my desire to be a creative, I
Right.
wanted to make sure that I really understood what it meant to know how to run a business. And
Yeah.
so because of that, that he would feel that my creative endeavors were going to be okay because he knew he could trust me to handle the business side, right? So there was definitely a self-serving and a desire to gather that sort of recognition from him that, yeah, you know what, Jason's okay. He can figure this out.
I mean, it's, I gotta admit, you know, my side of life has generally not have been on the art side, right? You know, I'm you know, I've been on the business side, the accounting side, but I do appreciate great art. But what always has driven me crazy is when potential is not realized.
Mm.
And what's interesting is on the, I'll call it the artist side, there's often this feeling that I'm selling out if I'm making money,
Mm.
right? I'm selling out if I actually turn commercial. And I feel it's such a shame because I really feel it's a lie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't have to be an or, it could be an and how fortunate for you that you learned that early, that it can be an and, right? It can be one and the same. And by the way, this is not where I anticipated this podcast going, but I love this conversation
Yeah.
because it's powerful, right? And it goes into, once again, and this is where I'm kind of intentionally moving towards this from the business side too. There's often this massive misunderstanding of why we're creating a brand. And you know, we live in the shadows, right, of Nike, which is
Sure.
the best, right?
Yep.
That and maybe Apple, but the best branded companies. Is that fair to say, Jason? I mean, you're better than this.
Well, in terms of, it depends on how you define it, right? But in terms of brand value, Apple is probably number one. But in terms of owning and defining and continuing to redefine their brand as a brand, I mean, Nike does it exceptionally well. Proud to have worked there and for them to have been a client for a long time. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And so it's amazing, right? It's amazing when you see it working, right? If that makes sense,
Absolutely.
and people
Yeah.
understanding why. So this might be unfair, but I'm going to ask it just
Sure.
maybe out of, I'm curious now, right? Why? Why does a brand get somebody to buy?
Well, there's usually a couple of reasons. It's usually not just a single reason, right? So, and in a perfect world, right, you combine multiples of these. And I'm probably off the top of my head will not be comprehensive. So I'll caveat it with that. The product has to be good, right? So there's a value in the product or service, right? There's something inherently valuable in what it is that you do. Second, that there's some sort of connection to the consumer. I need it. It fulfills something that I need to have done or a service that I need to do. Or it connects to the consumer in an emotional way. So I feel connected to this. It becomes, you've probably heard the term, I'm part of that tribe, right?
Mm.
I connect to that in a way. Seth Godin talks about that a lot, right? That idea of becoming a part of this group, and therefore I want to do that. Explain to me why we have um, an army of teenage and young adults walking around with tube socks and Crocs on right now. Right? I mean, it's not an aesthetically pleasing look.
No,
And
and let's add to it. We live in the Northwest where it's
where it's
raining
wet
consistently
everywhere.
9 months of the year, right? And why
Exactly.
would you wear Crocs?
Why are you wearing Crocs? And as a 19-year-old, why are you clamoring to have the Lightning McQueen Crocs with the little light up things, right? So there's this sense of both irony to it. There's a sense of playfulness to it. There's a sense of they're not that comfortable. I'm told. I'm not part of that tribe, right? So you look at all of those things, and why is that connecting, right? And I don't mean to disparage Crocs at all, because whatever they're doing, they are absolutely creating a a tribe. Now, I will point out one thing to them that I think they absolutely missed on. All of a sudden, they started creating like high heel Crocs, and they started to branch away from where that core was, right? Well, I mean, I get it, right? You're trying to test, but I think they've retracted some of those things. But that's, I mean, is it fulfilling a need? I guess, right? But it's not what its original need was, right? Which was it was a water shoe. That's where it started. That's the name. That's what it all began. But as it began to pick up popularity, it pivoted, and they were really smart in the way that they approached it. And they said, "Hey, who is becoming our audience?" And they actually allowed their audience to dictate how they were going to approach their brand. And they said, "Yes." Right? Instead of, no, hey, we're just a water shoe. We do this. No, they didn't. Right? And so they reached out and they said, yes, this is what we're going to do. Right? So their tribe helped to dictate what that company was, and they embraced it. And then they became more of that, and they continued to lead that tribe. Again, I'm overusing the Seth Godinisms, but that's kind of how they did that. So you have that. Um,
Can I interrupt just for a second, Jason? Because how often do you think the company, based on your experiences and based on what you know, because this is your life, how often does the clients who are looking to create this brand are actually doing research with potential customers versus they're coming up with it based on their instinct? How often is that? Like, did Crocs go, oh wow, we're having this, and they're telling us, right, because of input, and so we're going to move towards there, or is it just like, it's more of a gut feel, but I think we can?
yeah, it probably wouldn't be too hard to find out. I don't know. Actually, I didn't do any research on Crocs ahead of time. I wish I had. I would say, based on my experience with my clients and those that I have, I would say that there is a bit of both. I think in certain cases, and I would say in the clients that are most connected to being and continuing to be relevant, right? And with that, I think understand the value of malleability. They are willing to listen and be open to the opportunities that are presented. But they're also very, the ones that are really smart are the ones that understand what their core, I'll use a Nike phrase, their core maxims are, right? Which is to say, these are our tenets. These are the things that drive us. And if it fits within our tenets and this is something that makes sense for us and we want to make a pivot or a shift or an innovation, then yes, we're going to go that way. And if it's because our customers want to drive us there, then and they are telling us that, then we're going to go there. Now, if it's something that they say that they want, but it's outside of our tenets, we say we understand, but we're not going there, right? Because it's not us. Yeah. Companies there are a lot of companies, particularly within the tech world, that have made that mistake. And almost, well, some have tanked themselves and others have grown to become companies that they're really not. And then later had to retract so much just to save themselves. One of my beloved clients, Tektronix, was one of those, where they grew to take on all sorts of things. And they started as a company that was engineering
oscilloscope, right? I mean,
oscilloscopes, and they was engineering measurement tools, right? And they were excellent at it. But then all of a sudden, they're making everything from scanners and just all sorts of things. And in order to protect themselves, they had to scale back and get really technical again, and they scaled back. And they were really smart in doing so, but they got away from what they were really great at. And I don't think they intentionally were trying to get out of what their tenets were necessarily, but I think they lost, you've got good to great sitting on your table back there, but they lost what their hedgehog concept, what that focus, what that drive of what they were really great at was. So I don't think that means that being great at what you do doesn't mean that you shouldn't innovate and allow the influence from your customers and what they are driving for to help influence you. I think you should, but I think you have to stay true to the core of who you are. Otherwise, it creates dissonance. One of another classic example is when, when Harley Davidson decided to go into cologne.
Oops.
What does that smell like? Does it smell like
gasoline,
motor oil, or diesel? What does that smell like, right? I mean,
smell like an armpit of a motorcycle driver.
Yeah, is it leather and gas, right? Like, so it's a at one point they were trying to merchandise everything that was Harley Davidson. Well, maybe cologne's one step too far, right? So it's those sort of things that you kind of have to take a look at and say, yeah, our customers will buy anything that has Harley Davidson on it because it's Harley Davidson. Well, do we need to provide them everything? No, let's stay true to who Harley Davidson is, right? So,
I remember Jared from Subway.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, of course.
I mean, it was the brand. Jared became the brand, and then look what happened.
Yeah.
Jared did something wrong. Jared destroyed the whole company. I live in a little town, Jason, North Plains, Oregon.
Yep.
The Subway just closed down.
Oh.
Nobody would have dreamed when Jared was at its heyday. And what's really interesting is when they try to recreate themselves, instead of just going one because they didn't want to make that mistake again, all of a sudden they had 15 people representing them.
Right.
but that wasn't, was that their brand? Like, who was the brand now, right? It was like lost in that. And I think there's this reputation. And then, of course, they had competitors that just took advantage, right? Where all of a sudden Subway was no longer the trusted sandwich anymore, right? Um,
Well, they
and
forgot the message that he was sharing too,
yes,
right? They completely left the
yes,
message,
yes, correct.
and they just thought, oh, if this guy says it, then they forgot the message completely,
Yep.
and their product suffered actually. And so instead of doubling down on product and pushing the message that they were originally trying to push with him, uh, they went the opposite way. So yeah, unfortunate.
And um, man, this so gosh, we obviously are going to have more than one in the future because there's like so many different paths we could go into. Just discussions of great branding and bad branding, right? You know,
Sure.
I think of the days. It's that think of Jordan and Nike, right? You know,
Well,
I mean, one of the great examples where his brand is worth more today than it was when he was playing basketball, right?
yeah.
The Jordan brands, and it's remarkable. But what's interesting too is I want to be careful here of because just our friends at Nike, but when you pick athletes that don't become as popular anymore, it can hurt you, right? It
Well,
can
their
it can hurt.
transition when he retired, that it was a little bit challenging. I actually worked with them at that time when he first retired, and they brought in some other athletes, and many of those were really great athletes, right? But and the idea was to choose athletes that sort of embodied that idea or the mentality of what it meant to be someone that represented the Jordan brand. And I think all of the strategy and the ideas behind that were right. But it's really difficult to take a legend and
Mhm.
arguably the greatest of all time, right? And then try to fill that from a brand perspective in other ways. I think they've grown into it in a different way now than they did right after the retirement. So it'll be interesting to see what they do moving forward. They've got different leadership now too, not
Mhm.
just in Brand Jordan, but collectively at Nike.
CEO,
So
yeah,
it'll be
yeah.
interesting. So
Yeah. No, it's super fascinating around that. And once again, Tektronix, for those who don't know, which was just mentioned, um, that was at one time in the Northwest, specifically in Oregon. It was the largest private employer in Oregon, had over 30,000 employees.
yeah,
Today it has like 2,000 or something like that. And Danaher, of course, is the owner now of that company, 2 or 3,000. I don't know the exact number anymore, but it's a crazy how, once again, a large organization can lose its focus and then become a shell of what it used to be, right? And it's just fascinating how that process changes, goes through, and it's never for a lack of smart people.
no,
Like,
very smart people there,
I mean,
and
just brilliant people.
yeah, exactly. And I think it's intention, and I would say this too. I don't think what's the best way to say this. I think you can be really smart and make good choices and it still not work out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is sometimes very difficult. Maybe this is our pivot to startups, um, which is a difficult pill to swallow, right? At times, things simply don't go the way you want them to go. Um, I think you can. I think you can mitigate as much as possible. I think you can make all the best choices you want to give yourself the highest possible chance of success. And I think by doing that, I think your opportunity for success is really high. But I've been asked many times, well, why don't you guarantee in your contracts with your clients that they're going to get X% return or whatever it might be? And you go, well, you simply can't do that. It's simply not something that there are so many variables and so many factors in doing that. It's simply not something that's possible or viable. And so it doesn't have to do. Oftentimes you'll find somebody wants to point the finger at somebody to say you guys are they're the reason you didn't succeed. That's that's often not the case. Now, there can be a person or persons that have made mistakes that have caused things to not be successful. But the reality is sometimes timing and alignment just isn't right. So if I can, and this is not a startup, but this is a significant evolution of a brand, within the design world, there has been a huge maligning of the brand choice of Jaguar's new release, right? The logo has come out and it's, we'll call it modern and very, I won't even call it austere. It's kind of, I wouldn't say it's particularly innovative in terms of the new mark. They've kind of removed the Jaguar itself. They released this big budget ad that didn't show a car. They had just people and colors, and it was very avant-garde, and everybody online had an opinion. In fact, there's a well-known designer that one of his marketing tactics is to take people's big name logos and to redesign them and kind of put them out there and say, here's my take on your logo. And he does a really good job. And he took their logo and said, hey, if I was to do a redesign, this is how I would do it. His logo got way more hits than the Jaguar logo itself, right? Somebody was asking me on a different blog or a podcast about this logo. And I said, don't be surprised if the marketing team behind this isn't really just a genius, because everybody right now is talking about Jaguar. When was the last time anybody was talking about Jaguar? Right? This is a company that has a historic brand with a very stodgy history. Everybody's talking about how they've lost their history. They no longer know who their audience is. And my comment was their audience wasn't buying their cars. Right? They weren't. Their audience was buying other cars. And they decided, this is my supposition. I could be completely wrong, by the way. But my supposition was, in the boardroom, they decided we are not competing with these other brands anymore. So why don't we make a massive pivot? Huge risk, by the way, massive risk. Let's make a huge pivot. And instead, we want to hit a younger age group with money, and we want to make a major splash. And we're risking a whole bunch to do this. So if we're going to talk to this other audience, we've got to be completely different. So let's get a little bit aggro. And they've created this whole campaign that everybody is barking about. And guess what? Everybody's watching. When they released the new release of this new car, everyone's like, whoa, this doesn't look like a Jaguar. This doesn't look like anything. This is meant for a different audience. Oh, really? Shocking. So are they making a significant pivot that's attracting younger audience with money? And guess what they're going to want to buy, because they're speaking to that audience. So back to what we were talking about in terms of resonance and trying to break in and create tribe. They're trying to create this avant-garde, we're willing to be what you want, because their old audience was no longer interested in their brand. Now, it's a risk, and I don't know how it's going to play out, but if that's what they were doing to get those eyeballs and be there, they're giving themselves, I think, the best chance they have to be successful. So I don't think they were idiots. Everybody online was calling them just morons and idiots. They have no clue. And I'm sitting there going, I don't think they're idiots, right? I don't think they put idiots in that position. Maybe give them the benefit of the doubt. They're probably pretty smart folks over there.
Okay. Jason, if you're open to this,
sure.
Are you open to doing another podcast?
Of course.
But what I'd like that next podcast to be is branding for startups.
Let's do it. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Because clearly this branding, we talked more about the big company, right?
Sure.
And why they're doing it and the impact that it had. But there's an audience that you and I both talk to as well, which is that startup audience, right? And people in the early stages, and I think that discussion is so going to be so important, so powerful for them to hear your voice, your expertise on this.
Well,
So
we didn't get a chance really to talk about that personal experience I had in that space
yes,
myself.
yes,
So, and
yeah,
we can
exactly.
do
So we
that.
have more to talk about, but I mean, that said, this is obviously we've been needing to get together to talk, and we just decided to record it for those who are listening on a podcast. But this is going to be fun. I think this has been awesome insights. I'm not even going to ask my other normal podcast questions because this is only part one, and so Jason. Um, Maybe just kind of one little maybe final message for those, and once again we've been talking more of the big company, but if you were to like leave our listeners with kind of like that one big thing, that if they're once again part of that bigger company that's thinking of making a change or maybe improving their branding for what they've done, what's that kind of one message you'd share with them?
I actually think it's the same for large companies as it is for smaller companies, but I think it's more challenging for larger companies, which is to have a really core set of maxims that the company collectively has bought in on.
Hmm.
This is who we are, and it can be as simple as the key things that why we do what we do, and it's sometimes people think about those mission statements or those, and sometimes the way they're written can be a little bit trite or earnest. um, I encourage them to be as clear and as direct as possible.
Hmm.
And because of that, you don't want them to be misinterpreted. I don't think you want them to be esoteric. I think you want them to be really clear. And I don't think you necessarily want them to shy away from the fact that as a company, you want to be successful, right? But I also don't think that success means that your customers are not receiving value in return, right?
Yeah.
That it's not a me versus them. And sometimes I've seen in both large companies and in small companies that it's a us against them. So if we win, they lose. Instead, I really do believe that in those maxims that it is a win-win situation where we provide something great, we are compensated for it, and you get something great in return from that. But if the company has a really clear identity as to who they are, we can build something great from that.
Jason, it has been awesome once again to officially have you on the big podcast here, Measure Less Podcast. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it very much.
And to everyone who's listening, I'm really excited to have Jason on again. I mean, we're probably going to go 2 or 3 or 4. We're definitely going to do a part 2 on how to do branding for startups. I think it's going to be a lot of fun and talk about the different decisions they have to make because there's so many different things and lack of budget and starting out for the first time. And that will be a tremendous amount of fun. I look forward to learning from that. And we always like to say, I hope you encourage you, like, share this with others if you listen to this podcast. And as we always like to say, wishing you the very best at measuring your success. Have a great day.